Welcome to Behind the Story. I'm JD Long-Garcia, Senior Editor at American Media. Today we'll be discussing the situation on the U.S Mexico border. Immigration is a topic that is constantly politicized, and the current situation, with the influx of migrants and unaccompanied minors, is no different. However, with the eyes of faith, we are called to see things differently. These are human beings and not numbers. Dylan Corbett is the Executive Director of the Hope Border Institute, a grassroots organization that brings Catholic social teaching to bear on the U.S Mexico border. You can learn more about Hope at hopeborder.org. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Good to be with you.
Let's get the first question out of the way here. Is there a crisis on the U.S Mexico border?
Yeah, that's a tough question to answer. There's a couple different ways you can look at it. If you look at the numbers, oftentimes when people talk about a crisis at the border, they think about uncontrolled numbers of people coming to the border. And if you just kind of look at exactly where we are in terms of arrivals at the U.S. Mexico border, in the first quarter of 2021, there's not a crisis. There are increasing numbers, and we have seen certainly a significant rise in the amount of children who are coming to the U.S. Mexico border. But these are not unprecedented numbers. These are certainly not unmanageable numbers. There have been several in the last decade. There have been several times that the numbers at the border have gone up. There are peaks and valleys in terms of arrivals. So we saw a significant increase in the amount of people coming in 2014, then again in 2016, then again in 2019, and now again in 2021 we're seeing an uptick. And 2021 could be a significant year in terms of arrivals, but not unprecedented. And those different years when we've had arrivals at the U.S. Mexico border have been under different administrations, both Democrat and Republican. So it's hard to speak of a crisis in terms of the numbers. Now, if right now you're an asylum-seeking family, if you're seeking refuge and asylum, protection from persecution or extreme violence in your home country, and you come to the U.S. Mexico border right now, there's a good chance that you'll be expelled and that you won't be offered even an opportunity to make an asylum claim. Now, that's a crisis for that individual. That's a crisis for that family. So it's a question of perspective, both political perspective, looking at the numbers over the years, but also whose perspective do we adopt when we ask questions like that? Usually when we start talking about a crisis at the border, the situation has become too hyper-politicized, and it's an unhelpful question. We have to drill down and look at the reality of what's actually happening. So not an easy answer, but not an easy question.
For our audience members, Dylan, just to remind them, you're there in El Paso, Texas, so you have that firsthand experience of what things are going on. What have you witnessed? What can you tell us about the people that are coming and the stories that they're sharing with you?
Sure. So we work here at the Hope Border Institute. We're a binational organization, and we work in the two sister cities of El Paso, Texas, which is all the way in West El Paso, and Ciudad Juarez, which is a city in northern Mexico in the state of Chihuahua. And we're sister cities. We're right next to each other, cheek and jowl on the U.S. Mexico border. People cross every day, students cross every day, families cross every day, workers cross every day. So a very dynamic and fluid population. What migration looks like right now is what it's looked like for the past decade, really. What we're seeing is an increase in asylum-seeking families coming from Central America. And that's been a constant. That's been a real constant, especially over the last decade. And so that continues to happen. And this area is a real corridor for migration coming up northward from places like Central America. Right now, though, there are some peculiarities to immigration at the border. Folks are aware of the rise in unaccompanied youth and children who are coming. Certainly, this is also a corridor for migration of unaccompanied youth and minors. And we are seeing an increase in that. And it's very complicated. It's hard to break down the picture of what child migration looks like because There are a lot of different reasons that minors come up from Central America. We're talking primarily about Central American minors, but they'll often come up with family, or they'll come up with groups. They'll come up with guides. They'll come up in large groups, mixed families. It's very complicated. And then sometimes by the time they get to the border, they might cross independently or with other children or minors. And so that's certainly something that we're seeing at the border. We've also seen the numbers of people who were placed in Remain in Mexico. Folks are probably familiar with Remain in Mexico. So people were returned to communities like Ciudad Juarez. Here in Ciudad Juarez, we had several thousand people who were returned. There were about 65,000 people in total who were returned to Mexico under that policy. Those folks are being given an opportunity to come back to make their asylum claims from the safety of the United States, which is the ordinary process for an asylum seeker. So we're seeing those folks come up. Oftentimes it's families, and really a dynamic population. There are folks from Cuba, from Guatemala, other countries in Central America. It's a very dynamic population, and now if they haven't been here for the last 2 years waiting out this program, they're coming back after they've returned to their home countries. And then there's also been a real rise in unaccompanied, in single adults who are crossing the border, and we haven't seen that for some time. Families have really become the number one driver of migration at the border, but we're also seeing single adults, and I think that coincides with much of the Mexican immigration as well that we're seeing, immigration from Mexico. In the last 10 years, immigration from Mexico has really become negligible. It's gone down quite a bit, and been eclipsed by immigration from other countries like Guatemala, El Salvador. But we're seeing a rise too in that, and I think that's a reflection of increased violence in Mexico, but also the effects of the pandemic. What we're seeing now in this part of the border is that virtually everybody who comes to the border, except for those people who were placed in Remain in Mexico, virtually everybody is being returned back to Ciudad Juarez. So folks who are trying to come over, even if they're asylum seekers, are being forcibly returned under a pandemic-related order called Title 42, which gives the administration, or the administration claims it has the ability to return people to Mexico summarily without hearing their claims, without ensuring due process. So a lot of those people are being returned. And then we're also getting people from other parts of the border who are crossing from other parts of the border who are being flown here only to be returned back to Ciudad Juarez. So very dynamic, but migration at the border is always dynamic and complex.
It's hard to believe. I mean, I understand the complexity that you're describing in terms of the different factors that are pushing migrants to make sometimes very desperate choices, and that they're fleeing a lot of danger. In I think for the common person in the audience, that there is a correlation, maybe not a causality, with the Biden administration. Having reported quite a bit on immigration, I certainly have a different sense about our country's outlook in terms of migrants. And I've seen photos of people on the border with Biden shirts. Are you hearing that from migrants? Is that not, are they more hopeful about their chances given the new administration?
Yes, I think that the Biden administration. Well, first of all, candidate Biden ran on a platform where he really committed to restoring asylum at the border. So the Trump administration, of course, made every effort, legal and illegal, in many cases, to restrict asylum at the border, to restrict immigration broadly to the United States. And took a lot of significant steps and made that a reality. Things like Remain in Mexico, for example. Title 42 was implemented at the beginning of the pandemic last year in April of 2020. That was a Trump administration policy originally. And so the Biden administration has to its credit, made good on many of the campaign promises. So they've rolled back Remain in Mexico. That process is happening as we speak. They've also they are receiving unaccompanied minors at the border. So those unaccompanied youth and young people who are coming to the border received and not returned. At the close of the Trump administration took an unprecedented step and began to expel unaccompanied minors at the border, which was really horrific, a horrific policy. So the Biden administration has ended that. It should be said, though, that that's the law, that federal courts had already stepped in at the end of last year and ordering the Trump administration to reverse that policy. So it's not a specific Biden policy. It's the law. It's been the law since President George W. Bush. But it's important. It's an important sign. They've some really aspirational executive orders at the beginning around restoring refugee policy, the United States' commitment to leading on refugee resettlement in the world, reviewing things like climate change and protections for people who fall into the global protection gap, because climate change really isn't a grounds right now for asylum, but looking at that and trying to see how that might be remedied. Stopping the border wall, that was a powerful symbol. So stopping the construction on the border wall, and making sure that we were trying to reunite families of those who had been separated under the Trump administration. There are several hundred families that have still not been reunited, and so the Biden administration announced that that would be a priority. So there's been a number of things that the Biden administration has done, from changing the narrative, changing the tone to how we talk about immigration, and then taking some real policy steps. So there's expectation that Biden would have more humanitarian policies at the border. In practice, however, that hasn't happened.
That's interesting to hear that difference between possibly perception and action thus far. The other thing that I want to ask you about is just in terms of the unaccompanied minors and the situation that they're in right now. We've had, for what it's worth, Ted Cruz shared a lot of different images from inside the detention centers. I don't believe that the veracity of those images has been questioned. Maybe whether or not he should have shared them has been questioned. But media in general hasn't been allowed to enter a lot of these detention centers to see what circumstances they're in. Certainly, as a person in the media, I'd want to respect the dignity of those children that are in detention. But at the same time, that's a measure of accountability. Have you guys been able to go in there, and if so, what have you seen?
You mentioned accountability and you mentioned transparency, and the fact is that border enforcement agencies like CBP, like Border Patrol, immigration enforcement agencies like ICE, they've been plagued by a lack of accountability and a lack of transparency for decades. It's just unfortunately part of the DNA of those institutions, and that's been a bipartisan issue. It's happened under both administrations. It's been disappointing to see the lack of transparency continue under the Biden administration, and the lack of access of the media to some of the processing centers and the child reception sites along the border is indicative of that. I also want to recognize that there are people in those agencies who are struggling to make sure that those children are treated with dignity and they're not exploited, as can happen. You mentioned, I think, politicians coming down to the border. This is something that the human dignity is exploited on a regular basis here at the border. So it's a balancing act. The reality is that there's a couple things going on in terms of the challenges with receiving children. The numbers are going up. That's one part of it. Another part of it is the pandemic. The pandemic has put a real strain on the ability of these institutions, these agencies, to receive migrants at the border, because it's just a question of avoiding contagion, and so spacing becomes a real issue. It's a significant issue. And so there are two stages when children are received at the border. There are basically two stages to that. First, they're received by the border enforcement agency. So typically, a child who comes to the border will turn themselves in to the nearest border enforcement agent that they can find. So child crosses the river, child crosses the border, finds a Border Patrol agent, and turns themselves in. And so they'll be in the custody of Border Patrol until Border Patrol can get them to another agency, which is the Office of Refugee Resettlement of the Department of Health and Human Services. Now, because of the pandemic and because the Trump administration really, started to just they left the infrastructure abandoned at the border because they were expelling so many people under Title 42, and then it began to return child minors. There really was a problem in terms of a lack of adequate personnel and lack of adequate infrastructure at the border. So the Biden administration is trying to recover from that under the pressure of a pandemic. And so what happens is normally children are supposed to be in the custody of border enforcement only 72 hours and then transferred to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which contracts out to child processing centers, which are basically shelters. And they're there for about 30 days until they can be reunited with their sponsors or their family in the United States. That process, in theory, it's a good process. It was passed at the close of the Bush administration as a law, and it was bipartisan. It was meant to make sure that children who are coming from non-contiguous countries, basically anywhere but Canada and Mexico, that we don't return them in an expedited way because we want to guarantee their due process rights because they're children and minors. So we need to pay special attention to ensure that if they are asylum seekers, that they have the opportunity to present those claims. And then we don't want to return them to situations of danger, of child trafficking, exploitation. So we take special care with unaccompanied minors. Now, that whole system right now has been blocked up by the lack of infrastructure and by the pandemic. There's backlogs. And so the problem is that more children are spending more time in the custody of border enforcement agencies, not 72 hours, but we're talking about days and days and days and days before they're handed off to ORR. That's a red flag because border enforcement agencies do not have a good track record when dealing with people, when sheltering people for significant amounts of time. The facilities are awful. The agents are simply not trained. There aren't qualified staff to ensure child protection, health, safety, et cetera, et cetera. Under the Trump administration, we saw more children die than had died, in the past decade or more. We saw more adults die in immigration custody than had died in the past decade or more. So those places are bad. Those are. It's a red flag when they're holding on to children for that long. So we need to get them out under the authority of the Health and Human Services so that they can be reunited with sponsors and family members. So the Biden administration is taking good steps to open up additional facilities here in Texas, in California, in other parts of the country, so that we can address the bottlenecks. But they were a little flat-footed, frankly. This is something that was going on. The increase in children was going on for some months, so they could have predicted this. But they are taking the right steps now, and that's what's important. But these facilities, they're still problematic. CBP. The problem is this: that the border enforcement agencies, all they are really trained, all they are really funded to do, their DNA is simply to detain and deport, detain and deport, detain and deport. But when we're talking about children and asylum seekers, it's a different paradigm that we have not addressed the reality of immigration on the ground. We have personnel and agencies that are trained just to detain and deport, and little else. So when you present the challenge of asylum seeking families and children, there's a conflict that happens.
With respect to unaccompanied minors in particular, it seems like in immigration, sometimes what we get stuck on is blaming each other, perhaps, without really talking about solutions. Maybe before we move on to solutions, I want to raise one question or possibility. Is money. One of the things that we say in journalism all the time is, follow the money. And I know that human trafficking and human smuggling is it's huge. There's a lot of money. It's very lucrative, unfortunately, for people that are involved in that. Can you comment on that? What role human smuggling, human trafficking has on, especially today with unaccompanied minors that are coming north?
Yeah. Money has a real, a real pernicious influence on this whole reality of human migration. There's the reality north of the border, and there's the reality south of the border. South of the border, we're talking about trafficking, we're talking about smuggling. North of the border, there's also the reality of money influencing how we deal with immigrants. So, I was talking about child migration. We've seen human rights abuses in the care of unaccompanied minors at the border, and oftentimes those come from organizations that are profit based. And so when there's a profit margin, when there's a profit motive, you introduce a real, just a terrible uh, dynamic. And there have been organizations, for example, that have reducing services, reducing the standard and quality of care, et cetera, et cetera. And then also there's been patterns and practices of these organizations keeping children for longer periods of time than they need to be kept. Um, and we know that there are psychosocial consequences of children being kept in prison-like facilities. Immigrant detention, there's a strong profit motive in immigrant detention. Many of these, many of the organizations, many of the detention centers are managed and run by for-profit corporations, which have an interest in detaining more and more migrants. So there's evil effects, we would say, I guess, in the Catholic moral tradition, um, when you introduce the profit motive into detaining human beings north of the border. South of the border, there's also money can have real there can be bad consequences in terms of smuggling. But I think that the reality is that whenever we've tried to limit migration at the border, whenever we try to stop it, um, either by criminalizing the act of migration or our borders, what happens is there will be people who will find a way around that. And those guides or smugglers or coyotes or whatever you want to call them, there's a profit motive, so to speak, for people to try to find ways around that system. And there will always be people who offer their services to make that happen. So the solution is, yes, to address the criminality and smuggling. That's important, but we need to recognize that as long as there is as long as if we continue to stop human mobility at the border, the only way that we're going to finally address human smuggling is to make sure that there are legal pathways for people to enter into the United States. The more we try to harden the border, the more business smugglers get. Remain in Mexico is a perfect example. When the Trump administration put into place Remain in Mexico, um, ostensibly one of the reasons was to stop issues of human smuggling at the border and to stop illegal immigration. Um, that was a boon. Remain in Mexico was a boon to human smuggling, and it was a boon also to people who migrants at the border. There was increased kidnapping, increased extortion, increased homicides of migrants at the border. Um, so whenever we try to harden the border without allowing people legal pathways to enter, we incentivize, there are perverse incentives for things like smuggling.
Right. And then I suppose in addition to another way to curb it would be to address those circumstances in the sending countries as well, that I know that we've talked about a number of times in the past. Just for the most recent story that I wrote about immigration, Dylan, you were generous enough to give me some time for that. But you talked about this, the current situation as an opportunity for the church, and just an opportunity for us to really live out the gospel, bring Catholic social teaching into play for the circumstances that we're seeing right now. Can you talk to me more about that? Can you share more of what that vision would be for the church to be more participatory in responding to this situation?
Yeah, those who are on the front lines of what's happening with human mobility, with people on the move at the border, they've long been people of faith, been faith communities in the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church has played a major role in offering people hospitality through a network of migrant shelters in the region in Central America and Mexico, and then here at the border. The Catholic Church has had a role um, in receiving refugees, in resettling refugees throughout the world and also in the Americas. So the church has a lot of practical experience in welcoming the stranger, in welcoming Christ who comes to us in the migrant. And the church has a lot of, social capital, so to speak. There are a lot of people in the church, men and women, religious, priests, dioceses, our social social institutions like Catholic Relief Services and others have long been involved in different aspects of the reality of migration. Um, there's a major opportunity right now for the church to demonstrate um, that the reality of people on the move at the border is not a threat. We have an opportunity to speak a different narrative, to lift up the reality that people on the move are present us with not a threat, not something to be afraid of, but a challenge to human solidarity. They remind us of our interconnectedness, and I think that's what we've seen in the pandemic. That we're all related. That unless we focus on the least privileged, on the most vulnerable, then we're not going to get through crises like the pandemic together. We're not going to address things like human migration in the Americas unless we address it together. So the church has a significant role to play in changing the narrative. But then, because the church has so much experience in this domain, there's an opportunity to partner with the Biden administration on addressing root causes. The church is intimately familiar with the push factors in Central America, in Mexico right now, and the church, it also has the institutions capable of, we're able to work collaboratively with the Biden administration in order to prioritize the most vulnerable right now, to ensure that they have the protections that they need. It's a major opportunity for the church to spread the good news of the gospel, but also to make a contribution, a positive contribution to receiving people on the move at the border.
Thank you, Dylan, for joining us on Behind the Story today, and for providing such a nuanced perspective from your place there on the border. So too often on this issue, we get oversimplified pictures, and you've really helped us complicate the narrative today.
Yeah, it's been great to be with you. Thank you.
And thank you for joining us on Behind the Story today. For more videos like this, subscribe to America's YouTube channel. And for more reporting on immigration and other international issues, visit americamagazine.org. Thanks again.